I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight. Just wait for everybody to take a seat real quick.
On Monday, January 16th, Bucknell professor Marcellus Andrews wrote an open email to the Bucknell community addressing his concerns about discrimination on campus in light of the rise of Donald Trump to the White House. In his email, the professor specifically singled out the conservative libertarian students at Bucknell, calling us racist and fascist for arranging a guest lecture event that occurred almost a year ago. Alarmingly, Professor Andrews claimed that the students who felt targeted by last February's speaker needed to, quote, be able to impose a steep and lasting price on the racists and fascists that organized the event. In the same email, Andrews claimed that in his younger days, when he was extremely skilled at combat,
he would respond to fascists and racists by rearranging their faces and snapping their bones in order to change their minds. As conservative and libertarian students, we believe that Professor Andrews deserves the intellectual space and academic freedom to say and write what he pleases. But we believe instructing students to impose a steep and lasting price on students for organizing a guest lecture event isn't protected by the same academic freedom that we fight for. Although I don't believe this professor was instructing students to use violence as a tactic against me or my conservative and libertarian peers, his email could have easily been interpreted in such a way. After I politely asked Professor Andrews, who I've never met, in an email to explain what he meant by, quote, impose a steep and lasting price, he claimed my doing so had confirmed for him his suspicion that there was a collaboration between, quote, students who hate dark folks and the Bucknell faculty. But what was Professor Andrews so alarmed about? Was our event truly racist or fascist? That night, the speaker argued that, quote, there was stuff left to do in America on race. African Americans are still owed something. Then, speaking much like an intersectional feminist, the speaker addressed the struggles faced particularly by African American females, who he suggested are on the receiving end of cross-sectional institutional discrimination. Just a few weeks ago, this same speaker condemned white nationalists, arguing that you should focus on what unites people and not what drives them apart. You shouldn't give a crap about skin color. You shouldn't give a crap about sexuality. You shouldn't give a crap about gender, and you should be deeply suspicious of the people who do. What was perhaps more alarming than Professor Andrews' conduct in this email to me was the administration's response. In a meeting held with the administration, an administrator refused to call Professor Andrews' conduct inappropriate, choosing instead to say that the administration would have preferred that he had used different language. The administration accepted Professor Andrews' cheap explanation that by, quote, impose a steep and lasting price, he merely meant that marginalized students were to engage me in calm and peaceful discussion. The administration's response confirmed for me that conservative and libertarian students won't be protected from mistreatment as long as that mistreatment is delivered in the name of social justice. I want to be clear. Professor Andrews' conduct and the university's weak response is not acceptable. I will do everything in my power to ensure that every living conservative and libertarian Bucknellian and their wallets know that our university finds Professor Andrews' ugly public threat to be an acceptable form of conduct for our faculty. I have never met Professor Andrews. I've never sat in his classroom. Because of this, in a sense, Professor Andrews has become the monster he has spent his life hoping to destroy. As an African American, Professor Andrews has probably faced a lifetime of discrimination, but this provides him no justification to pass a collective judgment on me and my peers based upon the political beliefs that we hold. The incident with Professor Andrews certainly isn't the first of its kind. In a recent survey of over 2,000 Yale students, over 75% of those surveyed agreed that Yale does not provide a welcoming environment for conservative students to share their opinions on political issues. In the past few weeks, violence has erupted at several guest lecture events around the country featuring moderate, conservative, and libertarian speakers. Vice co-founder Gavin McInnes was pepper sprayed before an event in which he was set to speak at NYU. Violent riots erupted at UC Berkeley last week in response to an event featuring the same speaker we had here on this stage last February. There is a concern on this campus on the faces that you don't see, in the corners of this campus that you don't visit. It is in those corners where you will find those of us that constantly have our moralities brought into question in the classroom by our peers, friends, and family for daring to believe that the state shouldn't be used as an apparatus to cure society's injustices. Conservative and libertarian students can't argue against the passage of a $15 minimum wage law without being considered cold and unfeeling. Despite the volumes of economic research that makes the reasonable case that a $15 minimum wage would actually hurt low-skilled workers by pricing them out of the labor market, it's the unflinching arrogance of campus leftists that would allow them to skip the debate on the issue and go right to labeling their detractors as selfish and cold-hearted cynics who would rather people die in the streets then force employers to put a few extra dollars in their employees' pockets. Because of this lack of intellectual freedom, Bucknellians only speak non-progressive thoughts in hushed tones, behind closed doors, and under the assumption that everything said stays between the two parties of a politically incorrect conversation. In an email addressed to the Bucknell community, a professor smeared and gave explicit instructions that students should lash out at me and my conservative and libertarian peers for inviting a guest speaker that brought a strong anti-racist message to campus. And although the administration addressed the incident quickly, their repeated refusal to call Professor Andrews' conduct inappropriate speaks volumes about the disdain that they have for Bucknellians that don't submit to our campus's progressive orthodoxy. This attitude that conduct that would otherwise be considered unacceptable if not done in the name of social justice presents a dangerous, slippery slope. Just last week, the protesters at UC Berkeley seemingly took the advice of Professor Andrews and elected to rearrange the faces and snap the bones of students waiting in line to hear the same speaker we had here on the stage last February. Student attendees were beaten with flagpoles, punched, bruised, and pepper sprayed. Windows were broken. A UC Berkeley administrator allegedly bragged on social media about punching an attendee. Despite the violence, only one arrest was made. Influential comedy film producer Judd Apatow celebrated the violence at Berkeley, claiming that this was only the beginning. I'm often told that I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, that it's not possible for a member of a demographic group that is not traditionally considered to be marginalized to be discriminated against in the university. But Professor Andrews' conduct and the administration's response has proved to me otherwise. The violence at Berkeley and the inaction of the police in arresting the organizers and perpetrators of the violence has convinced me otherwise. A slate of editorials released by the independent student newspaper of UC Berkeley, the Daily Californian, entitled "Violence is Self-Defense," not only justified the violence, but even claimed that it was necessary to protect student safety from ideas. It should be a concern for us all that some of our nation's brightest students attending one of our nation's best public universities, the same university that gave birth to the free speech movement, believes that violence is an acceptable response to an inflammatory guest speaker. This is what helps to create white identitarian groups, white supremacist groups. Both the legal system and our institutions, our universities, setting different standards of expected decency for people based on the way that they look or the political beliefs that they hold. My time as a student activist is coming to a close. Above all else, I've learned in these 4 years that the American political landscape is in desperate need of individuals who have the capacity to bring us together and remind us of our common humanity, regardless of race, gender identity, sexuality, or political persuasion. As Bucknellians, we should all strive to be this kind of person. Tonight, we continue the practice of promoting intellectual diversity at Bucknell by welcoming Christina Hoff Sommers. Christina is an author, former philosophy professor, and a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank. Sommers is known for a critique of contemporary feminism, and her works include the books Who Stole Feminism?, The War Against Boys, and her writing has been featured in a variety of different media outlets, including the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and she also hosts a very popular video blog called The Factual Feminist. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Christina Hoff Sommers.
Oh, I'm sort of behind this. Can I move this? Rearranging the furniture here. Factual Feminist, reporting to duty. I am very happy to be here this evening. And I want to thank the Young Americas Foundation for sponsoring this event and the Bucknell College conservatives, libertarians, free thinkers. I recently spoke at Portland State University, and activists were sending out sort of frantic notices that they were going to protest, and more ominously, a group of outside agitators, not students, but they were called the Portland Anti-Fascists. They announced they were going to sabotage the event. Now, at the last minute, they changed their mind. Something bigger came up. I think they heard Milo was speaking in the next state, and they left Portland and did not attend. But some protesters came nevertheless. And as I went in to meet my host, who was a philosophy professor, he was surrounded with 6 sort of big guys, and he told me that these were coaches and instructors from his martial arts academy in Portland, and they were going to be my bodyguards. And he said, these guys are packing more power, than a team of Navy SEALs, so you're fine. And I said, why do I need this? And he said, you need it. This is Portland. But it's not only Portland. Everywhere I speak these days, the administration provides a police detail. And at Cal State LA, there was even an ambulance on hand. Now, I have been speaking on campuses for many years. There were never ambulances and police details and bodyguards. So the question is, what's going on? I first became aware of a change on the campus in 2015 when I spoke at Oberlin, Georgetown, and UMass Boston. I host a weekly, ideally a weekly video blog called The Factual Feminist, where I spend most of my time correcting what I see as feminist myths and mistakes and bogus statistics. I consider myself a feminist, but I am persuaded women are helped by truth, not hype, not spin, no matter how well intended. But the gender activists at Oberlin, Georgetown, UMass, they objected to my criticisms of their deeply held beliefs and considered my challenge to be triggering. And at UMass, as I was speaking, a young woman kept screaming, F you, F you, and there were several hecklers in the audience who wouldn't allow me to speak. At Oberlin, they organized safe spaces where students could flee from what one Oberlin professor had called my discursive violence. In fact, at Oberlin, 30 women and a therapy dog fled to a safe space during my talk. And I triggered a dog. I'm sorry about that. Now, banning and threatening speakers, it's now common on the college campus. So is monitoring and policing speech, humor. Comedians are now hesitate to go to many campuses. And a new vocabulary has emerged of trigger warnings and microaggressions and safe spaces. The organization FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, it's a bipartisan civil rights organization, and they keep track of violations of free speech on campus. And I urge you to go to their website. Now, some of it is against left-wing students, but the vast majority are against conservative students. And it's now not on all campuses, and I'm sure Bucknell is an admirable exception, but on many campuses, it's just not a safe space for speech, for free expression. Free speech, due process, and other liberal ideals, these are at risk. And I once, and I could give you a lot of examples, and we could laugh at them. Some of them are funny, some of them are heartbreaking. But instead of laughing at them, I want to explore why are left-wingers on campus doing this? Why this move towards monitoring speech and speech codes? And on many campuses, FIRE, just the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, just put out a report about what they're called bias response teams. And if you're on campus and there's an incidence of bias, you can report it to this commission that includes police officers. I mean, how did this come to be? And if you look what they're reporting, I mean, we can all think of cases of frightening incidents of racism or anti-Semitism on campus, but they're reporting jokes. They're reporting somebody made a penis out of ice, an ice sculpture. I mean, many of these things. Some of them simply would report that a professor gave some conservative opinions. This is all very dismaying to me as a philosophy professor of many years, and one of my favorite philosophers, John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty. And what has happened to that, and is it being taught, and what forces are creating this? Now, if you ask some of those who are promoting safe spaces, wanting to come down on people for microaggressions, what would they say? Well, I've read a number of attempted justifications, and I'll just summarize it for you, what they seem to be saying. And then I'll evaluate it. It would go something like this. Pathologies like racism, sexism, transphobia, these are deeply ingrained in American society. And on the college campus, there are growing numbers of students who are just not going to put up with it anymore. Free speech and other liberal ideals, they have mainly benefited the powerful. So safe spaces and trigger warnings, etc., these are ways of empowering marginalized people, giving them a voice, giving them a shot at liberty. And if someone comes to your campus spreading hatred or they want to justify the old system of exclusion, yeah, they'll be disinvited, they'll be heckled. That's the price for progress. So that's Jessica Valente, for example, is a well-known feminist writer, and she gave an argument like that in The Guardian about a year ago. And she ended her article by saying, we're not stopping free speech, we're making speech better. And I saw an NYU law school student on a panel about free speech, and she said, what we're doing is building a society where we don't hurt one another. Now, I happen to agree with the goals of ridding our society of sexism, misogyny, other forms of bigotry. I hope all of you do too. And I don't want people to be hurt. But I am convinced that the campus activists are going about it the wrong way. And I think they're doing more harm than good. I don't think they're achieving their goals. What they are doing is turning our campuses into hostile environments for reason and for freedom. Now, before I go any further, I just want to tell you a brief word about my background. Way back in the last century, in the early 1990s, I was a feminist academic in good standing. I was invited to feminist conferences and asked to review papers for feminist journals. My courses at Clark University were cross-listed with women's studies. That all changed when I published a book in 1994 called Who Stole Feminism? That book was feminist. I am a strong believer in classical equality feminism. But I argued that, or let me put it this way, I rejected the idea that American women were oppressed. For the most part, I said equality feminism, it was a great success story. By the 1990s, American women were among the freest, most liberated in the world. Yes, there were still challenges. Yes, there were still inequities. But to speak of American society as a patriarchy, or to refer to American women as second-class citizens, that seemed to me to be ridiculous, well, unsustainable. And I gave a lot of arguments about why I thought so. Now, when my book first came out, some prominent feminists agreed with me. Feminism is diverse. There are many different schools, and there are one school of sort of libertarian feminists and more classically liberal feminists. I got some fan letters from Nadine Strawson. She was then president of the ACLU. I got a very nice letter from Erica Jong, who was a sort of pro-sex feminist, a novelist, and wrote Fear of Flying. But for the most part, the feminist establishment was displeased, and I was quickly subjected to a colorful array of attacks for my heresies. Many feminist leaders were convinced that professors and activists were convinced that the United States is an oppressive patriarchy. They did not appreciate my pleas for moderation, and I was called a backlasher, a traitor to my gender, anti-woman. One angry critic even referred to Christina Hoff Sommers and Margaret Thatcher, those two female impersonators, a non-woman. Now, by the way, someone called me that recently, a female impersonator, a non-woman. They called me that on Tumblr, and they were quickly called out by someone who said that was the wrong word to use. I think they said the proper word is differently gendered. Well, I don't think I'm differently gendered. I'm an age-enhanced woman, philosophy professor, and I think that it's my penchant for logic and reason and rules of evidence that got me in trouble. And by the way, I should tell you, just as an aside, this has not been easy for my mother and father. I lost my father a few years ago, but my mother's still with me, and my parents. You can't be more liberal than my parents. They are so liberal, and when my dad was liberal, and they're dismayed to find their daughter caught in all of these controversies and sometimes reviled by people they admire and admired by those whom they regard as diabolical. And my father used to listen to Rush Limbaugh on the radio just to get angry. And my mother would say, turn him off, and it's not good for your blood pressure, And Daddy would, okay, turn it off. And as soon as Mom wasn't in the car, he'd turn it on and get really mad at Rush. And one day, Rush Limbaugh, he hadn't read my book, but he made all sorts of assumptions, and he said, well, I think I like this woman, Christina Hoff Sommers. And my dad almost lost control of the car. And on one occasion, even though my parents were very worried about what I was writing, they always, especially my dad, was a loyal fan. Whatever I wrote, whatever I did, he wanted to read it. He was happy. And I was once interviewed by Playboy magazine. And my dad was eager to get a copy of the interview. But what do you do when you're an 82-year-old man in Vermont? They were living there at the time. We're all from California, but they're living in Vermont. California wasn't liberal enough. They had to go there. And in Vermont, he felt a little embarrassed about going to the store and buying Playboy. So he drove over to New Hampshire, to the more libertarian Keene, less puritanical than Vermont, where nobody knew him. And he was a little embarrassed. He felt he had to explain himself. And he said he was buying Playboy. He said, I'm only buying this because my daughter's in it. Anyway, back to my topic about what's gone wrong on campus. How do we explain this new era of repression? Maybe that's an overstatement. Maybe it's turning around. I hope so. But what I saw last week when Milo Yiannopoulos was speaking at Berkeley, what I've experienced on campuses. Now, here's why I'm very worried. I'm not only worried about the antics and the fighting and the intolerance, even the ideas. And these ideas have bothered me for a long time. And let's just go back. I think to understand the trigger warning, safe space, victim-focused theories on campus, it helps to go back to see some of the roots and where this got started. Now, my first experience was in 1992 when I attended the annual meetings of the National Women's Studies Association in Austin, Texas. Now, what I saw there does not reflect all of women's studies. As I said, there are many different schools of thought, but the women that were gathered there in 1992, intersectional feminism was in vogue there. Today it's in vogue all over the campus, but it was starting to take hold in the Women's Studies Association. And as soon as I arrived at this conference, by the way, I wasn't there to participate. I was writing an article about the state of feminist scholarship on campus. I was writing it for The Atlantic, and I thought this would be an interesting place to go, and it was. On the first day, participants were told to break up into groups based on their grievance identities. And what happened was there were groups of Asian American women, African American women, old women, Jewish women, disabled women, fat women. None of these groups proved stable. The fat women polarized into a gay and straight faction. Members of the black lesbian group couldn't get along because some of them had white partners, and that was supposed to have given them privilege. They had to form their own group. New identities emerged. A group of women with allergies formed, and they set demands. We were not supposed to wear dry clean clothing or hairspray, and they were very agitated. it was a group of scholars, but we didn't resolve differences through rational discussion. Instead, intersectionality, at least at that conference, created new reasons for anger. It just devoured itself. By the way, I ended up bonding with a group of radical lesbian separatists. I don't share their identity or their politics, but they all smoked, and I needed a cigarette at the end. I'm not a smoker, but it was absolutely traumatizing just to see these antics. Now, some of these scholars at the conference, they went back to their universities, and they've been, for the last 20 years or so, they've been writing articles and starting programs, task force, working groups. They have a set of advocacy statistics to complement their grievance theories. And you may have heard, 1 in 4 women will be raped, 1 in 3 battered, women cheated out of 25% of their salary. And that's only if they're not dead from an eating disorder that they developed in response to patriarchal standards of beauty. Now, what I thought when I wrote Who Stole Feminism, what I think now is that sexual assault, workplace discrimination, domestic violence, eating disorders, these are serious problems. And they require intelligent solutions, sober analysis. But what I find in reviews of women's studies textbooks and fact sheets over the years is that at the heart of campus feminism, it seems to me, is a body of dubious information and a mix of untruths and exaggeration and creating a kind of panic today. Now let me give you an example. Take something like the wage gap. How many times have you heard that for the same work, a woman is paid 77 cents on the dollar, and 70 cents for what a man's paid $1? Now, that is misleading because, just think about it. If employers could save 23% by hiring women, they'd fire all the men. That would have happened. The gap is just the difference between the average wages of all working men and women. It ignores factors that justify differential pay, type of job, education, hours worked per week. When these factors are taken into account, the gender gap narrows to the point of vanishing. Depends on the study, but sometimes they'll find a few cents they can't account for. It could be discrimination. As an equity feminist, I want to know if it is, but it could be something else. We don't know. But I never find it, so far, in my review of campus literature and the major women's organizations, I never find it discussed that way. It's almost always presented as an injustice practiced against women. And a few years ago, this became my most famous tweet. It was called Offend a Student Day or something, and I just said, if you want to close the wage gap, step 1, change your major from feminist dance therapy to electrical engineering. And if you look at that tweet, it has like 25,000 likes, but not everybody who read it liked it because there are long comments, a lot of comments underneath it. And they're saying, no, even when women, and if you look, I put it as my signature tweet, on top, and so it's still, you can find it there. And then it's an endless, and I've interacted with people, I'm happy to, and they'll say to me, no, even if women became petroleum engineers, they earn less. And that is true, but then what you have to do is look at women petroleum engineers, and compare hours worked per week, willingness to move to North Dakota, and you just find that there almost always a reasonable explanation for the differential. And for example, someone on Twitter said to me, male nurses earn more than female nurses, same profession, and even a traditional women's profession. It isn't that, and they find it especially outrageous that male nurses earn more. But the fact is, male nurses go into, on average, I've read some very good analyses of male and female nurses, and the male nurses tend to go into the higher paying specialties. They dominate in nurse anesthesiology. They work longer hours. They disproportionately find jobs in cities with the highest compensation. Now, activist groups and my Twitter followers, they have an answer to that. They'll say, well, the reason, women can't move to these places and they can't work longer hours, so there's still a gender issue here. And they're driven by, this was the National Organization for Women. It said that there's this deeper injustice, that women are driven by powerful, sexist stereotypes and to take on these professions or take all the burdens of childhood. Now, that's true, but if it's because women are having children, then it's not because they're being cheated out of their salary. It's because they're going into different fields and they have different life priorities. I'm not saying there aren't things we could do, but the wage gap isn't just women being cheated out of whatever they say. Women earn only 77 cents, 78 cents an hour. That's not an accurate way to present it. And if you say, well, if you look at majors, like at this school, if you just looked at what people are majoring, if this school is typical, you would find that computer science and economics, you'll have more men, and women, you'd have far more in the in English and in psychology, sociology, education. I find it strange to say that women are kind of pushed into those fields. That might have been the case 20, 30 years ago, but today women, especially American college women, are among the most free and self-determining people, and they're choosing to go into fields that interest them. I don't see how we can say, it's 2016, and American women, I just hesitate to say that our life choices, that we're making them, it seems to be divorced from reality. And recently on PBS, they had a program, Freakonomics, and they interviewed this brilliant economist, Claudia Golden, from Harvard University. And she said a lot of things I said, that most of the wage gap can be explained. She said that even if we switched and men did all the women's job and women did the men's job, she thinks that there would still be a wage gap favoring men. And she said, we haven't understood it. And it's too complicated to go into her explanation, but it had to do with basically jobs. The biggest gaps are in jobs where there's a huge premium for being able to work weird hours and long hours in law firms and financial firms and so forth. And there's where the big gap is. Even in medicine, male doctors work many more hours. And she had some interesting ideas on what we could do. She wasn't sure what would work, but she agrees with me. It is a problem that women earn less, but let's analyze it properly. It's not just like employers are cheating women out of their salary and everybody's angry. No, it's actually a different problem. And I just urge you to listen to that program. And anyway, I don't want to keep going on about the wage gap, but this is what gets me in trouble, is bringing these things up. And or take the idea, I'll just move on to another idea. I'll come back to the wage gap later, because I know there's more to say. But it's more complicated. I've never seen it presented this way in women's studies textbooks. It's usually just a given that women are, there's this wage discrimination. Look at something like male privilege. Is it really the case that men are so much better off than women in American society? I think modern society is a complicated mix of burdens and advantages for each sex. Women are assumed to be the have-nots, because there's a massive lobby that devotes itself to proving Venus is worse off than Mars. But Mars affliction, those go unnoticed. I'll just mention a few. Most of the of the back-breaking, lethally dangerous jobs in our society, roofer, logger, roustabout, coal miner, just to name a few, these are done by men. And the Labor Department reports that about 5,000 Americans die in the workplace each year. 90%, or about 4,400, are men. We always hear that only 24 women are CEOs of the Fortune 500. That's a problem, I agree. But what about the unfortunate 4,400 men? It's almost as if you have to look at the whole society. There are a very elite group of men who are highly privileged, but if you look at men across, the whole spectrum, socioeconomic spectrum, it's a different picture. Look at education. Education beyond high school has been called the passport to the American dream. Increasingly, women have it, men don't. From the earliest grades, our schools do a better job of educating and motivating girls. And now women earn the majority of college degrees and advanced degrees. And the intersectionalist narrative, tells us that males, especially white males, they're the most in need of atoning for their privilege. But recent government data shows that now Hispanic and Native American women are more likely to go to college than white men. Now, yes, just go to the Department of Education and look at the data. There has been an amazing success story among Hispanic women, and no one talks about it. It's still as if men are held back and women are ahead. They've mostly, 2 years. Pew Research has a good story about it, and they show that Hispanic women, a few percentages ahead of white men, taken as a group. But this year they were only one percentage point ahead, but they have caught up or they're ahead, and this is the scene in education. But it seems to me that our women's lobby deploys this faulty logic. In cases where men are better off than women, that's injustice. Where women are doing better, well, that's just life, I think that if Mars needs to check his privilege, so does Venus. But mostly, why play this game? Why are so many activists out to promote divisiveness? I think that men and women, we're not two opposing teams competing for a single trophy. We're in this together. Now, today on the campus, the fashion is intersectional feminism. And according to intersectional feminism, pathologies like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, these are not separate systems. They connect, they overlap, they create complex arrangement of advantages and burdens. Now, if this were simply a recommendation, if intersectionality were simply an approach for social scientists or social activists, urging them to consider diversity of opinion, diversity of perspective, and to attend to marginalized people, that would be well and good. That would be fine. I have no quarrel with that. I am concerned with intersectional feminism as it is being taught and practiced on many college campuses. Now, this theory, which is sort of official doctrine in many gender studies programs, it portrays American society as a, to use their expression, matrix of domination and oppression. And by the way, the list of oppressions keeps growing. Bell Hooks, a prominent gender theorist and intersectional theorist, she has referred to the United States as an imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. And actress Laverne Cox, who's a frequent campus lecturer, she expanded Hooks' formulation in a tweet. She said, actually, it's a cisnormative, heteronormative, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And others have added an ableist and lookist and pro-natalist and sizist. And there are a lot of ists and isms going on. Now, if you buy into this theory, as presented by some of its prominent theorists, you why would you worry about the niceties of politeness, civility, free expression? I mean, you're on an urgent mission to dismantle a relentless and lethal system of oppression. And why be respectful to invited speakers, who are little or more than, agents of the dominant narrative? Tear down their posters or screech obscenities at their talks, and if some white cisgendered guy on campus tries to dispute what you have to say by using logic and reason, tell him to check his privilege and stop mansplaining and shut the F up. And that happens on many campuses. I have problems with this theory, many problems, and I've made a factual feminist on the topic, but here's what bothers me most. First of all, I don't see the United States as a matrix of oppression. We're a flawed democracy. But for most Americans, it's a matrix of freedom and opportunity. And much of the world sees the United States that way. And then if you're going to say we're so terrible, show us a place where it's better. And yeah, you could point to Northern European countries, but those countries are not nearly have as large a population and as a diverse a population as ours. I'm not saying that we're perfect. We're far from perfect. We are flawed. But it seems to me underlying intersectionality is this very dark, unreal picture of the United States. And it seems to give permission. A part of the theory says that oppressed groups have a kind of privileged epistemology. They have a way of seeing the world and that gives them more insight into justice and well-being, and one should listen. And so that has turned into an idea to tell other people to check their privilege and listen. I don't think that you determine who has to listen or who has to check their privilege based on someone's race or gender or sexual preference. You go by the individual. What has happened in this system, what bothers me most is they're fighting racism and sexism by classifying everybody according to race and sex. That's not going to work. If you want to fight bigotry and sexism, focus on universal rights. Focus on our common humanity. What's happening is that the intersectionality on some campuses is breaking us up into warring identity groups. And as I said, we have these proliferating ists and isms. It's turning many of our campuses into hostile environments for friendship. Students are organizing themselves into aggrieved little tribes that police and bully one another for imagined slights and micro-invalidations. What happened at that women's conference in 1992, it's now happening on the campus. This is not deep liberation. This is not a more exalted and inclusive freedom. I don't see progress. I see folly. Now, it doesn't have to be this way. And that brings me back to my free speech event in Portland. It actually went very well, and I did not need the services of those 6 mixed martial arts experts. I'm very happy to report that in this, this was anarcho-vegan hipster intersectional protest capital of the world, Portland. 400 people came together. We did not all agree, but we managed to have a civil discussion. And some of the students who came to protest, initially they were jeering and, heckling the speakers, but soon then they listened, and I guess in the end, many of them stayed and joined the discussion. Now, at the very end of the event, this fellow on rollerblades rolled up to me. He skated up to me to say thank you, and he said that he had actually come to protest, but he'd enjoyed the discussion. By the way, he also had a mohawk, and I think he was wearing a cape. But in these riotous times right now, this event at Portland State University told me that we can still speak to one another as equals. We can respect one another's right to speak, to listen, to disagree. And if that can happen in Portlandia, it can happen in Bucknell, it can happen anywhere. Thank you.